We talked a bit about global warming last week with the IPCC sixth report coming out, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby Joyce, was drawn into the debate last week as all this talk about net zero emissions. The federal government's committed to it as soon as possible. Everyone else seems to want to put the date 2050 on it. Here's what Barnaby Joyce said last week.
The reason why is because nobody is telling us exactly what's involved in the plan. If you're going to just make an arbitrary claim, oh, we'll get to 2050, that's fine. Understand the emotion, understand almost the moral perspective of it, but you must lay down the plan. If the plan is we're all going to go to electric vehicles in Sydney and Melbourne and around the nation, fine. How are you going to do it? We don't actually come up with a plan. The CSIRO, other competent people come up with a plan.
Well, let's catch up with a coalition minister who's pretty keen on net zero by 2050. He's the New South Wales Environment and Energy Minister, Matt Kean. Thanks for joining us again, Matt. Do you have a plan that could help Barnaby Joyce out?
Well, we've got a plan, and that's a plan that involves reducing our emissions where it makes economic sense to do so. So where we can grow our economy, where we can create jobs, where we can lower power bills for families and businesses across New South Wales, then we should roll out those technologies or roll out that plan at scale because it makes economic sense to do so.
So only when it's cost effective?
Absolutely. I'm arguing that we should take action to reduce our emissions where we can build an economic case for it. And there are a number of parts of the economy where we can build that economic case because the technology is there to do so. There are a number of other parts of the economy which you and your viewers would know where there's not the technology available to be able to roll out at scale, where it will actually cost more money to take action to reduce our emissions. And there we should invest in the innovation and the technology development that we need to be able to crack that nut. But what I'm saying is that there are parts of the economy where we know we've got the technology available, where if we roll it out on scale, it actually makes economic sense to do so. So I don't know why we don't proceed in that direction.
Now, tell us about all this focus on net zero by 2050. It's the easiest promise in the world to make. It's to me, it's just political virtue signalling. I mean, you can say it now, it makes no difference, right? Because it's just words, it's so far away. The key is actually what you're doing when it comes to emissions reductions, what plans you're demonstrating to put in place to make sure we've got reliable and affordable energy in the meantime.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We need to have concrete plans to achieve these objectives. So, for example, in New South Wales, we've got a concrete plan in place that will ensure that when our existing sources of electricity generation come to the end of their technical lives, they're replaced with not only cleaner forms of electricity generation, but also forms that are cheaper and just as reliable. We've got a plan to do that. When it comes to vehicles across New South Wales, we're not just saying phase out combustion engine vehicles. We're putting in place a plan that will ensure that we roll out electric vehicles, the charging infrastructure, and the supports to enable that to be rolled out at scale. We've also got an industry and innovation plan, a $750 million plan to support our heavy industry, manufacturers like BlueScope and Tomago to transition their equipment to lower carbon technologies to enable them to compete in that new world that is emerging internationally. So we've got concrete plans in place that will go a long way to reducing our emissions, but in ways that will grow our economy, increase productivity and underwrite our prosperity into the future.
So where's the difference? Where's the difference between someone like you and Barnaby Joyce? Because everybody is full on in terms of reducing emissions. No one seems to be arguing against that. It's all about the pace and the cost, I suppose. For instance, you talk about electric vehicles. Why not just let the market deal with that? If people want to get electric vehicles, and if suppliers want to put in some electricity charging points and knock themselves out, why should you spend taxpayers' money putting that infrastructure in place?
Well, I think it's not only about spending taxpayers' money, it's also about putting the right market signals in place to encourage the private sector to be able to invest in these technologies.
Why have market signals? People
because we want to make sure that Well, I mean, we have market signals in place to ensure that we facilitate the rollout of essential infrastructure, for example. So if you didn't have market signals in place, let me tell you what would happen right now. People wouldn't be using coal-fired power. The reason being, you saw AGL had a $2 billion loss this week because their coal-fired power stations are not profitable. Now, if they
hang on a second, that market's been completely corrupted. If there was just a clear marketplace in the electricity sector, we'd all be using coal-fired power. There'd be no renewables.
Which is exactly why we need market signals in place to ensure that we have reliable power that's also cheap, that also is able to meet our needs. That's why I'm saying we need market signals. So, yes, you're right, Chris. There shouldn't just be subsidies and throwing money at problems. We should be putting in place the right market settings that will encourage the private sector to deliver the infrastructure that we're going to need to make sure that we can deliver reliable electricity, cheap electricity, and new technologies that will lower emissions.
Have you had a chat to Barnaby Joyce about these issues?
No, I haven't had a chat to Barnaby Joyce. I'm trying to encourage Barnaby Joyce. I'm trying to encourage politicians and community leaders to take action where it makes economic sense to do so, to set us up for success. We know that Australia can not only benefit from that transition to a low-carbon economy, but we can thrive in that world. We've got access to some of the best renewable resources anywhere on the planet. And that's not only good for domestic consumers and users of electricity, that will support our heavy industry, creating jobs, driving investment, and underwriting our prosperity into the future. Chris, as you know, today 50% of the world's GDP is being generated in jurisdictions that have committed to net zero emissions.
Committed.
In place.
Committed. There's a lot of committed going on. There's not much delivering. We will see. Sorry, that's all the time we've got, Matt. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch up on these issues again. Matt Kean, the New South Wales Energy and Environment Minister. A lot of committing to net zero by 2050. No one's going to... It's a long way off, right? And what Matt Kean calls a market signal, I generally call a subsidy. Still, we'll continue this debate, no doubt, for many months and years to come.